All right, so in this lesson, I want to do a review of the useEffect hook, but with a more complex example than just using console log. What I want to build is an app where the user can type any lowercase letter or a space with their keyboard, and I want to take all the letters the user has typed so far and output them to the screen in a fancy block quote. So as the user presses characters, they're going to see their text appear on the screen. In order to accomplish this, I want to add an event listener in my useEffect hook in my function, and I want to also make sure we remove the previous event listener when the effect runs again. And we're actually going to take a look at what happens if we forget to do that, if we forget the teardown part of the process in our useEffect function that we pass in there to that hook. So let's get started. So I know that I'm going to need a state variable to store everything that the user has typed so far. I'm going to call that user text, and we can get that by invoking the useState hook. So here I'm going to use const, open up my array destructuring syntax. We're going to have user text, and we're going to have a function to update the user text. I'm going to call that set user text. And we're going to get that back from, of course, the useState hook. And we have to provide it an initial starting value. It's just going to be an empty string, so the user can start typing from scratch. Next up, I can go ahead and return some JSX. This is going to be pretty simple. I'm going to have a div here to store everything. In here, I'm going to put an h1. This is going to act as a prompt. And in here, I'm going to write, feel free to type. Your text will show up below. Now we need to actually display the user text. I'm going to put that inside a block quote HTML element just to make it a little bit fancy for this lesson. And in here, using my curly braces, I'm going to interpolate or embed the value of my user text state variable. And this is the first part. It looks great. We're going to be able to show the value of our state variable, but we obviously still need to make sure that we're updating the state variable whenever the user actually types something on their keyboard. So in order for the browser to automatically update our user text state variable, I'm going to need to set up an event listener, and I can do that within the function or the effect that I pass into my useEffect hook. So right here, I'm going to do useEffect, and this is going to take a function. I'm going to pass in an anonymous arrow function, and in here, I'm going to do window, add event listener. This method takes two arguments. The first is a string that represents what event you want the browser to listen to. In this case, we want the browser to listen to a key down event, and that is kind of self-explanatory. This event happens whenever a key is pressed down, so whenever the user presses anything on their keyboard. The second argument to the add event listener method is what function or what event handler I want to execute whenever a key down event occurs. So in here, I'm going to call a function called handle user keypress, which we're going to define in just a second. But the basic setup here is whenever the component renders or re-renders, I'm going to make sure that I add an event listener to my window that tells the browser that whenever the user presses any key down, I want to invoke the handle user key press function. We can go ahead and define that function above, right in the body of our app component. So function handle user key press. Whenever the browser invokes this function, it's automatically going to pass it an event object. That event object is going to have a whole bunch of properties that we are interested in. So if I want to keep track of what the user has typed, the actual character, that is available as a property called key, which we can get from the event object. And also, since I want to limit this to simply spaces and lowercase characters, I'm also going to destructure a property here called key code. Now, if you don't know about key code, basically every single character on the keyboard is assigned a numeric key code, right? So, for example, the space bar has the value 32, and lowercase characters are given a number between 65 and 90, so that's about 26 characters. So what I want to do here is just put a basic conditional that's going to limit us to strictly key downs of the space bar as well as lowercase characters. So what I can do here is say if my key code is equal to 32, in other words, if the user has pressed the spacebar, or if my key code is greater than or equal to 65, and my key code is less than or equal to 90. This is just keeping track of all the lowercase characters. This is not important for understanding React hooks or the effect hook. This is just limiting our key presses to only being run whenever there's a space press or a lowercase character press. So whenever any of those are pressed, what I want to do then is update my state variable. I can do that by invoking my set user text function, passing it the next value of my user text state. And in order to get a combination of everything the user has typed so far, as well as their newly pressed key, what I can do is just use my template string syntax and interpolate the value of my existing user text, everything the user has typed so far, followed by whatever the user has just typed, which we have in our key property. So I'm just going to interpolate key right here. Save this, and that should do it. So I'm going to save this. We're going to see this appear in the browser. And on the surface, you can think it might appear functional. So I may type here, and we're typing, and the user's text is appearing on the screen. But there's actually a huge flaw in this design, and I want to explore that with you. So what I'm going to do here is refresh the page and open up my console. Let me, in fact, refresh the page again because we have this dead appear because I think Chrome is actually registering my press of the keys to open up my console, which is, by the way, Command-Option-I on a Mac. So let me refresh this so we have a blank console. And let's talk about what's going on here. So the Chrome console offers a convenient getEventListeners function, and it accepts a DOM node. So we can pass it something like window. And what this will return to us is an object where the properties or the keys here are the events, and the values are an array of all of the listeners for that event. So for example, we have our key down event here, and if I open this, it's an array of one listener, and this is the listener that has automatically been registered. And remember, the reason that this is here is because the useEffect hook has already run once. It runs whenever the component renders for the first time, or in other words, when it first mounts on the DOM, when we first visibly see it. So we have this return, we have this thing rendered to our screen, then useEffect runs, which means it runs our effect that we pass in, which means the event listener for the key down has been added, and here it appears right here. There's just one problem. What happens when I type a letter here? If I type the letter H, for example, and I rerun that function, we'll notice that our key down array now has two listeners. So we've added another event listener. And if I type another letter, like let's say E, and clear this and run the function again, you'll notice that we now have 4. It is doubling every single time. In fact, if I just type a couple more characters here, like hello, and run it again, in just that short amount of time, you'll notice that we now have 32 event listeners for our key down. So we're increasing exponentially. We're doubling by 2. And of course, if we keep going like this, eventually there's going to be so many event listeners that we're going to clog the browser and the page is going to run really, really slow, eventually potentially getting to the point where we crash the entire page. So this is not sustainable. Even though if we weren't looking at the console, our app is kind of functional. We can type characters on our keyboard and see the effect. We've actually entered this very dangerous territory right here because we're clogging up the memory and adding all of these event listeners. So the question becomes, why are these event listeners being added? Well, let's clear the output here and walk through it step by step. I'm going to refresh the page. So here's what's happening. As soon as the page loads, we already have one event listener registered. That's coming from the first time the useEffect hook has run. So what's happening is the next time we enter a key, the first key that we enter, the event listener that's automatically registered with Chrome is going to run the handle user keypress function. And what happens here is we're invoking the set user text function to update the user text state. But remember, whenever we invoke an update function, whenever we update the state, we force a component re-render. And whenever we force a component re-render, the useEffect hook runs automatically after. So the single event listener that we've registered will run whenever we type our first character here. And again, this is going to update the user text value, which in turn will re-render the component, which in turn will get useEffect to run again, which will add another event listener, right? So we're going to go from 1 to 2. So here's an example. We have get event listeners here. We have one total key down event. This is the one that's going to update the user text, which in turn will get the re-render, which in turn will cause the useEffect to add another event listener. So if I type H, we now have 2. So you can probably imagine what's going to happen the next time. The next time we run, both of these event listeners are each going to run. So each one of these, one at a time in sequence, is going to update the user text, which in turn is going to force the component to re-render, which in turn is going to get the useEffect hook to run again, which in turn is going to add another event listener. And this is going to happen twice now. So for the 2 here, we're going to add another 2 for a total of 4. And when we have 4, the exact same process is going to repeat, and they're going to create an event listener 4 times, which is going to bring us to 8, and then 16, and 32, etc. So each one of our event listeners is going to run, and in turn trigger the addition of another event listener. And that's precisely what makes this so dangerous. So of course, how can we fix this problem? The solution, of course, is to return a function from within the function that we pass into the useEffect hook. This, right now, on line 14, represents what I call the setup. This is setting up our component for use. But of course, we intentionally here forgot the teardown, the part that erases everything that we built up. Because if we forget to erase everything that we built up, we end up with a situation like this where we're going to continue stacking all the work. And it can get particularly dangerous, for example, if this component is, for example, removed from the screen. However, our event listener still persists on the window object, and we're still keeping track of this and trying to do something with a component that is no longer mounted. So we have to remember to tear down everything that we set up. And the way we tear this down is very simple. We just return a function from within our function. And all that we need to do in the body of this function is just the exact opposite of what we set up right here on line 14. So if we added this event listener, we can go ahead and do window remove event listener. And we want to tell it to remove the key down, and of course pass in the function that represents the function that we want to remove, the event listener that we want to no longer be active, and that is again going to be handle user key press. So now I can save this and we can compare the results in the browser. When I load the page and I take a look at my existing registered event listeners, we only have one, and as soon as I type my letter, what's going to happen, remember, is React is first going to run this queued up return function. So it's going to remove the previous event listener. Then it's going to run the useEffect hook again, and it's going to add this new event listener. So if I take a look at get event listeners right now, again, we're still going to have one event listener, but this is not the exact same one as was present whenever the page was loaded. This one right here was removed. This was done by the return function that was queued up, and now we have a brand new one. And now, no matter how many times we type, for example, hello world, you'll notice that we're not going to be stacking those key down event listeners. It's just going to be one at all times. It's going to be a changing one because we're removing the previous one, adding a new one, removing the previous one, adding a new one each time. However, we've avoided the stacking problem, which solves that huge memory potential catastrophe that we saw a few minutes ago. And that's all there is to cover in this lesson. This is a more realistic example of the useEffect hook in action. This kind of ties together the ideas of setting something up and then tearing it down with the function that we return from within our useEffect function. So I hope you've had fun, and I will see you in the next lesson.